Story 1. The Living Roots. I had hiked through Redwood National and State Parks many times, but the trail I chose that afternoon was unfamiliar. The redwoods towered above me like enormous pillars holding up the sky. Their trunks were wider than houses, their bark dark and ancient. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more the world outside seemed to fade away. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. The ground was tangled with massive roots that twisted across the soil like frozen waves. The trail map had shown a small loop cutting through an older section of the forest, a place where the redwoods were said to be among the oldest in California. I liked exploring areas that most hikers ignored. The path was narrow, but clear enough to follow. Ferns covered the forest floor in thick layers, brushing against my legs as I walked. Every few minutes I passed another enormous tree whose roots pushed up from the soil like stone walls. About an hour into the hike, the trail began to change. The dirt path grew uneven, broken by larger roots that forced me to step carefully between them. Some of the roots were as thick as my arm, others as wide as fallen logs. They twisted around each other in strange patterns, disappearing beneath the soil before rising again several feet away. I paused to examine them, amazed by how far they spread from the massive trunks above. Eventually, the trail faded completely. At first, I assumed I had simply missed a turn. I checked my map and GPS, but the signal was weak beneath the towering canopy. The device struggled to update my location. According to the map, the trail should still have been directly beneath my feet. Instead, I stood in a wide clearing filled with tangled roots and moss-covered stones. I turned slowly, trying to figure out which direction I had come from. The clearing was surrounded by redwoods larger than any I had seen before. Their trunks rose straight into the sky, disappearing into a canopy so high I couldn't see the tops. The roots around them formed thick ridges across the ground. It's almost like the ribs of some enormous creature buried beneath the forest floor. I stepped carefully between them, looking for the trail again, but every direction seemed identical. The forest had swallowed the path completely. I decided to head east, hoping to reconnect with the trail somewhere ahead. As I walked, the roots grew even thicker. Some rose 2 or 3 feet above the ground before diving back into the soil. Stepping over them became difficult, forcing me to slow down. I noticed something strange then. The roots didn't just twist randomly. They seemed to curve inward, forming long arcs that pointed toward the center of the clearing behind me. Curious, I turned back to look. From where I stood, the roots now seemed arranged in wide rings, spreading out from a massive redwood at the center of the clearing. The tree was enormous, even by redwood standards. Its trunk was scarred and ridged with deep grooves, and its base was surrounded by the largest roots I had seen yet. Something about the formation made my chest tighten. It looked less like natural growth and more like something arranged. I approached the giant tree slowly, stepping between the thick ridges of wood. The roots radiated outward in long lines, weaving together in complicated patterns. Moss filled the spaces between them, soft and damp beneath my boots. Up close, the trunk was wider than a small cabin. I tilted my head back, trying to see the top, but the canopy swallowed it completely. Standing beside it made me feel incredibly small. As I circled the base of the tree, I noticed something unsettling. Some of the roots weren't buried in soil at all. They rose fully above the ground, stretching across the clearing like enormous ropes. Several of them crossed the area I had just walked through. I was certain they hadn't been there before. I tried to convince myself I had simply missed them earlier, but the placement made no sense. I stepped over one of the roots and continued walking, trying to leave the clearing behind. A few minutes later, I glanced back again. My stomach tightened. The roots behind me looked different now. 2 of them had shifted positions slightly, bending toward the direction I had just walked. It wasn't a dramatic change, but enough to make the arrangement look wrong. I stared at them for several seconds, unsure whether my eyes were playing tricks. The forest remained completely still around me. No wind moved through the branches. No animals crossed the clearing, yet the roots behind me seemed closer than before. I stepped backward slowly, studying them. The thick wooden ridges formed a rough circle around the giant tree, and the space between them had narrowed. I felt a rising sense of unease, the kind that creeps in when something familiar begins behaving in a way it shouldn't. I turned and walked faster, stepping carefully over the roots as I moved away from the clearing. After several minutes, I stopped and looked down at the ground. The forest floor ahead was no longer covered in ferns and moss. Instead, More roots stretched across the soil, thicker and more tangled than before. They formed a dense network that forced me to zigzag between them. It felt like navigating through a maze of wood. Then I heard something behind me. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a deep grinding noise beneath the earth. I froze and turned around. The roots I had just crossed were shifting. One of them lifted slightly from the soil, pushing upward like a massive muscle flexing under skin. Dirt cracked and fell away as it moved. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the enormous roots settle into a new position. Panic surged through me. Roots don't move. Trees don't rearrange themselves. Yet the ground around the clearing had clearly shifted. The thick wooden ridges were no longer lying flat across the soil. Several had risen higher, forming curved barriers that blocked the path I had taken only minutes earlier. The opening I had used to leave the clearing was gone, replaced by a wall of tangled wood that twisted together like enormous fingers. I stepped back slowly, realizing something terrifying. The roots weren't growing randomly, they were moving with purpose. Every shift closed another gap between them, tightening the maze around me. The massive redwood at the center of the clearing loomed in the distance, its roots spreading outward like the limbs of a colossal creature buried beneath the forest floor. And with every quiet movement beneath the soil, the forest seemed to be pulling me closer to it. I tried to steady my breathing while studying the tangled network of roots around me. The forest hadn't moved quickly. That was the disturbing part. Every change happened gradually, almost patiently, like something enormous beneath the soil adjusting its grip. I stepped sideways between two thick roots, hoping to find another gap before the maze closed completely. The moment my weight shifted across the clearing, another grinding vibration traveled through the ground. Dirt crumbled along a nearby ridge of wood as a root slowly lifted higher from the soil. The movement wasn't violent or dramatic. It simply rose, angled slightly inward, and settled again, blocking the direction I had just considered. I turned quickly, searching for a path that still remained open. Every direction now held thick ridges of wood twisting across the clearing. They formed uneven corridors that seemed to guide movement toward the massive tree at the center. The pattern was impossible to ignore. No matter where I stepped, the openings narrowed toward that trunk. A faint vibration passed beneath my boots again. This time it felt stronger, like something shifting deeper underground. I glanced down just as a thin crack opened in the soil near my feet. From the darkness inside, a smaller root pushed upward through the dirt. It curled slowly across the surface, weaving itself into the larger network. My chest tightened as I backed away. The new root hadn't grown, it had emerged. Whatever lay beneath the forest floor was spreading outward, extending through the soil like an enormous living structure. The towering redwood in the clearing was no longer just a tree. It looked more like the visible spine of something buried far below. I tried moving faster, stepping across several roots in a desperate attempt to reach the edge of the clearing. For a moment, it looked like I might break through. Then another grinding sound echoed beneath the soil. A thick root lifted across the path ahead of me, arching upward before settling down again like a closing gate. My pulse hammered in my ears. The forest wasn't simply shifting randomly. It was reacting to me. Every movement I made seemed to trigger another adjustment beneath the ground. The openings continued tightening, guiding me back toward the massive trunk. No matter which direction I chose, the roots slowly curved inward. I looked toward the giant redwood again. The base of the trunk was surrounded by enormous ridges of wood rising from the soil like the ribs of some colossal animal. As I watched, several of those ridges lifted slightly, flexing just enough to reveal dark spaces beneath them before settling again. Something shifted in the earth below the tree. The ground trembled softly, sending loose soil sliding between the roots. I realized then that the entire clearing sat on top of an enormous network spreading outward in every direction. The roots weren't just attached to the tree. They were the forest. The realization struck me with sudden clarity. The redwoods here weren't separate trees competing for space. They were connected beneath the soil, feeding from the same ancient system. That system was responding to my presence. The maze tightening around me wasn't an accident. It was a trap closing slowly. A deep vibration rolled beneath the clearing again, stronger than before. Several roots shifted at once, rising slightly higher and tightening their circle around the giant trunk. The space between them shrank steadily. Dirt cracked along the surface as the ground compressed. The forest seemed to be drawing inward. I backed away toward the narrowest gap I could find, forcing myself through the twisting corridor of wood. Bark scraped against my jacket as I squeezed between two rising ridges. For a moment, the opening widened just enough for me to slip through, before the roots slowly leaned together again behind me. I ran blindly through the trees, jumping over thick roots and pushing through dense ferns. The deeper forest finally began to look familiar again. The massive clearing disappeared behind the trunks, hidden beneath the towering canopy. Only then did the vibrations beneath the soil fade into stillness. Several minutes later, I stumbled back onto the original trail. Narrow dirt path looked completely normal, winding peacefully between the enormous redwoods. I stood there breathing heavily, trying to convince myself the clearing had been some kind of illusion caused by exhaustion. But before leaving the forest, I looked back one final time. In the distance, between the towering trunks, a single thick root slowly pushed up through the soil beside the trail. It curved gently across the ground, inching toward the path as if testing the surface. Then it settled again, waiting for the next traveler. Story 2. The Treebound Prison. My brother Mark and I had been hiking through Redwood National Parks for 3 days when we decided to explore a section far beyond the popular trails. The forest there felt older and heavier than the rest of the park. Massive redwoods towered overhead like pillars supporting the sky. Their trunks were so wide it would take several people to wrap their arms around them. Even the air beneath them carried a cool, ancient smell of damp wood and moss. We followed a faint side trail branching away from the main path, hoping it would lead us deeper into one of the older groves marked on our map. The trail itself barely existed anymore, hidden beneath layers of fallen needles and thick ferns. A thin blanket of fog drifted slowly between the trees, weaving through the trunks and branches. It gave the entire forest a muted, dreamlike atmosphere that felt strangely detached from the outside world. As we moved deeper into the grove, the usual forest sounds faded away. The occasional bird call disappeared, and even the wind seemed unable to push through the towering trunks around us. Our boots pressed softly into the damp soil as we stepped over thick redwood roots, spreading across the ground like enormous veins. Mark checked his phone again to confirm our direction, though the signal struggled beneath the heavy canopy above us. Eventually, the faint trail disappeared entirely. In its place stood a wide clearing surrounded by a ring of massive redwoods. The trees here were larger than any we had seen earlier in the hike. Their trunks rose straight upward before vanishing into the fog high above. The clearing itself was covered in moss and scattered branches, giving it the appearance of a forgotten pocket of forest hidden far from the park's usual paths. I stepped into the clearing and glanced upward, admiring the sheer height of the surrounding trees. That was when something pale caught my eye high among the branches. At first I assumed it was a piece of cloth caught during a storm, but as the fog shifted slightly, the shape became clearer. My stomach tightened when I realized the outline looked disturbingly human. Suspended between two thick branches was the faint shape of a person. Its body hung motionless, arms dangling loosely toward the ground. The figure appeared almost weightless, drifting slightly within the fog. It didn't move like a body hanging from a rope. Instead, it seemed caught within the branches themselves, as though the tree had grown around it long ago. "Mark," I said quietly, pointing toward the branches above us. He followed my gaze and froze instantly beside me. As the fog drifted through the canopy, another pale figure slowly emerged from the mist several yards away. Then another appeared farther back. Within seconds, we realized the entire grove was filled with them. Dozens of ghostly figures hung throughout the upper branches of the redwoods. Some appeared tangled between limbs, while others floated just above them. Their bodies were pale and translucent, blending with the fog drifting through the canopy. Every single one faced downward toward the clearing below. Even from the ground, we could see the expressions on their faces, mouths stretched open in frozen screams. One of the figures shifted slightly as the fog rolled through the branches. Its face turned just enough for us to see its hollow eyes staring toward the ground. The expression carved across its features looked like pure terror, as though it had witnessed something unimaginable just before becoming trapped there. Mark took a slow step backward beside me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Those aren't bodies," he muttered. The figures above us drifted faintly with the fog, but never swung or dropped like real corpses would. Instead, they remained suspended among the branches, as though the trees themselves were holding them in place. Looking closer, I noticed something even more disturbing. Several of the figures appeared partially inside the branches. Thick limbs passed directly through their torsos or shoulders, as if the wood had grown around them over time. The sight sent a cold chill crawling down my spine. These weren't simply spirits drifting through the forest. Something in this grove had trapped them there permanently. The clearing suddenly felt colder than the rest of the forest. Neither of us wanted to remain beneath those suspended shapes any longer. Without speaking much, we turned and began walking back the way we had come. Ferns brushed against our legs as we pushed through them quickly, both of us eager to reach the safety of the main trail again. After several minutes of walking, the trees ahead opened into another clearing. At first I felt relieved, assuming we had reached the far edge of the grove. But something about the place made my stomach tighten immediately. The arrangement of the redwoods looked strangely familiar. I slowly lifted my head toward the canopy again. Pale shapes drifted between the branches above us. My heart dropped instantly. Dozens of ghostly figures hung there, just like before. Mark stared upward in disbelief, turning slowly in a circle. "We didn't turn around," he said quietly, his voice filled with confusion. As the fog shifted across the clearing, one of the figures lowered slightly from the branches above us. Unlike the others, its clothing looked newer, almost solid, its face tilted downward toward us. Then its arm lifted weakly, pointing toward the forest behind us. The gesture looked desperate, as though it was warning us to run before we became the next ones hanging among the trees. Mark gripped my arm when the ghost raised its hand toward the dense forest behind us. Without hesitation, we turned and forced our way through thick ferns and tangled roots. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself resisted our escape. Fog drifted among the trunks, shaping the shadows into impossible angles. Every direction looked the same, and the distant shapes of the redwoods seemed to shift when we weren't looking. We pressed onward, boots crunching over moss-covered roots. The air grew damp and cooler, brushing against our skin like a subtle warning. My chest tightened with every step. I glanced behind us repeatedly, expecting the ghostly figures to reappear. The forest remained eerily empty, yet an oppressive weight settled over us. Moments later, the trail opened into another clearing. My stomach sank. The arrangement of the redwoods felt disturbingly familiar, too much like the first grove. I hesitated before raising my head toward the canopy. The fog shifted, revealing pale figures suspended between massive branches once more. Their hollow eyes seemed to follow us across the clearing. Mark's face drained of color as he whispered. We didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed that we had been drawn deeper into the same forest loop. The ground beneath our feet felt less solid, as though the grove itself was reshaping to trap us. Several of the ghosts now hovered lower than before, their forms more defined in the drifting mist. One floated only 20 feet above the forest floor, arms dangling loosely, head tilted in a gaze that seemed to pierce our souls. The distant fog amplified the sound of my heartbeat, echoing across the clearing. The grove seemed alive, responding to our presence, adjusting its layout to ensure we could not find the exit we desperately sought. Mark pointed toward a narrow gap between two ancient trunks at the center of the clearing. "That's our only way through," he said. Hesitation threatened to root us in place, but the pale figure seemed to shift slightly, as if urging us forward. We scrambled across the mossy ground, ducking under thick branches. My lungs burned with exertion, and the fog clung to us like a living veil, obscuring the path ahead. As we neared the central tree, I noticed a narrow opening formed by two massive roots. It was almost invisible, concealed beneath ferns and fallen needles. The ghost who had first warned us hovered above the roots, gesturing insistently toward the gap. I crouched to inspect the passage while Mark glanced up nervously. The forest beyond the roots seemed darker, denser, as if it held its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. Mark led the way through the opening, ducking beneath the thick roots, and I followed immediately. The ground was uneven, twisted with roots so large they resembled fallen logs. Every step felt precarious, the forest pressing in around us. Fog wrapped the trunks in shifting patterns, shadows dancing across the mossy walls. For the first time since entering the grove, I felt a small, fragile hope that we might escape its grasp. The narrow path stretched ahead, barely wide enough for us to walk side by side. It twisted through dense roots and low-hanging branches. Faint light filtered from the canopy above, illuminating patches of moss along the ground. The eerie shapes of the redwoods towered around us, and even here, the forest seemed to hum with a quiet energy. Somewhere high in the canopy, distant fog drifted like smoke, brushing against unseen forms above. After several minutes of careful progress, the trees began to thin slightly. The fog lifted gradually, allowing more light to penetrate the canopy. My relief was tempered by a lingering unease. I glanced back over my shoulder and thought I saw fleeting glimpses of pale figures disappearing into the dense trunks. But the forest behind us remained silent. No sounds of movement, only the whisper of leaves and shifting mist. Finally, we reached the edge of the hidden grove. A wider trail emerged clearly on our map, lined with younger redwoods and bright ferns. Mark stopped and turned to look back toward the dense cluster of towering trunks. The fog shifted faintly, revealing a faint outline of the grove we had just fled. Suspended between the branches, the ghostly figures remained, watching silently as though we had been permitted a temporary reprieve. I froze when I noticed one figure missing. The ghost who had guided us through the roots was nowhere to be seen. A shiver ran down my spine. Somewhere deep within the forest, a new space had formed among the ancient trees, waiting patiently. The grove had accepted us briefly, but had not released its hold entirely. Something remained within, tethered to the shadows, observing, calculating, waiting for the next unwary visitor. Mark and I continued along the marked trail without speaking. Each step felt fragile, as though the forest might shift beneath our feet. Even as sunlight filtered through the thinning canopy, the memory of the grove clung to my thoughts. The mossy ground, the hollow screams above us, the feeling of being watched, all of it pressed on my mind. Every redwood trunk seemed taller, every shadow deeper than before. By the time we emerged onto the main trail, the forest felt lighter, almost ordinary. Yet both of us knew the grove still existed, hidden just beyond the ferns and roots. Its pale figures would remain, suspended eternally between the branches, waiting for someone else to stumble into their prison. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their gaze linger on us long after we had turned our backs. Mark finally broke the silence. "I don't think anyone leaves that place easily," he murmured. His words echoed in my mind. The grove had not allowed us a full escape. The ghostly entities had warned us, guided us, and now they remained suspended above. Still tethered to the ancient trees, their expressions frozen in terror. The forest itself seemed to pulse quietly, as though breathing, aware of each intruder who ventured too far. We walked on for another hour before reaching a ranger station at the edge of the park. Exhausted, shaken, and silent, we reported our experience but found no signs of the grove, no evidence of the ghostly figures. Only the map confirmed our route. Deep in the heart of the redwoods, the Treebound prison remained, hidden and waiting. Its branches still cradling the lost souls of those who had come too close and never truly escaped. Story 3. The Timber Stalker. The deeper backcountry trails inside the redwood forest always felt different from the areas near the park entrances. Once you passed the final ranger sign and continued along the narrower paths, the forest changed in a way that felt almost ancient. The trees became larger, older, and impossibly tall. Their trunks rose like enormous pillars before disappearing into the dim canopy far above. Even in late afternoon, the ground beneath them already felt like evening. My friend Aaron and I had planned a 2-night hike deep inside the remote sections of the park. We both preferred places where crowds rarely ventured, and the wilderness felt untouched. Late that afternoon, we discovered a small clearing, surrounded by massive redwoods. A shallow creek curved along the edge of the site, its water slipping quietly over smooth stones. The clearing felt protected by the enormous trees, like a natural shelter carved into the forest itself. While unpacking our gear, Aaron paused beside one of the nearest trunks and raised his flashlight toward the bark. Several long scratches carved deep, vertical grooves along the tree. At first glance, they resembled marks left by a bear. But the deeper we looked, the stranger they appeared. The gouges were wide and uneven, climbing nearly 10 feet above the ground. The cuts looked powerful, as though something had dragged massive claws upward through the thick bark. Aaron pressed his palm against one of the grooves, measuring its width. The marks were nearly the span of 2 fingers across. Bears could scratch trees, but these seemed unusually deep and widely spaced. We studied the trunk for another moment before returning to our camp gear. Strange marks were common in wild forests, and neither of us wanted to overthink it. Still, as we continued unpacking our equipment, I kept glancing back toward those claw scars. The sun dropped lower behind the thick canopy, and the forest dimmed quickly. Redwood branches far above blocked most of the fading light, leaving the ground in shadow earlier than expected. We finished setting up the tent and gathered fallen branches for a small fire. The scent of damp soil and cedar bark drifted through the air as the flames began to crackle. Sitting among those towering trunks made the clearing feel enormous and strangely quiet. By the time we finished dinner, darkness had settled completely beneath the trees. Our fire provided the only real light in the clearing, sending flickering shadows up the redwood trunks. Aaron leaned back against a log and began telling a story about a strange camping trip he once had in the Sierra Nevada. He had barely reached the middle of the story when a deep sound rolled through the forest. The noise came out as a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It echoed between the redwoods and lingered in the air for several seconds before fading. Aaron stopped speaking immediately. We both turned toward the darkness beyond the firelight, listening carefully. The sound carried a depth that made my chest tighten. It didn't resemble any animal call I had heard during years of hiking through forests like this one. For several long moments, nothing else happened. The forest returned to its earlier calm. Somewhere nearby, the creek continued to murmur softly over the rocks. I almost convinced myself the growl had come from some distant animal echoing strangely through the trees. Then a sharp crack echoed from the darkness behind us, loud enough to make both of us jump. Aaron immediately grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam toward the tree line. I did the same, scanning between the enormous trunks. Something had clearly snapped a thick branch somewhere beyond the clearing, but the light revealed nothing except layers of ferns and towering redwood columns fading into darkness. No movement appeared. No animal shapes stepped into view. Then the growl returned. This time it was closer. The vibration rolled across the clearing and through the ground beneath our boots. Aaron slowly stood up beside the fire and lifted his flashlight higher, sweeping the beam across the forest. The light slid across bark and moss before settling on the same tree where we had earlier noticed the strange scratches. Fresh claw marks now cut into the bark beneath the older ones. The pale wood beneath the surface looked newly exposed, bright against the dark trunk. Whatever had carved them had done so recently, perhaps only moments earlier. Aaron stepped closer and ran the beam along the gouges, his expression tightening. The new scratches were larger than the earlier ones. Each groove ran several inches deep, and the spacing suggested something with enormous claws. Aaron placed his hand against the bark beside the marks, and even with his fingers spread wide, the claw spacing extended far beyond them. A heavy feeling settled in my stomach as we both imagined the size of the creature that could produce damage like that. Another sound drifted through the forest before either of us could speak. This time it wasn't a growl. A heavy thud shook the ground somewhere beyond the trees. Several seconds later, another impact followed, closer than the first. Something large was moving through the redwoods toward our clearing. Branches snapped loudly as the unseen creature pushed through the dense forest. The sounds carried a weight that suggested something enormous forcing its way between the trunks. Then one of the smaller trees at the edge of the clearing suddenly leaned sideways. For a moment it hung there at an angle before crashing violently to the ground. The impact shook the earth beneath our feet. Aaron and I stared at the fallen trunk in disbelief. No animal native to this forest should have been capable of knocking down a tree that size. The broken sapling lay crushed among the ferns just beyond our firelight. Then the growl returned again, louder than before. Something massive was circling the clearing just outside the reach of the flames, watching our campsite and slowly moving closer through the towering redwoods. The growl rolled through the clearing again, deeper and more powerful than before. The sound vibrated through the ground beneath the fire pit, making the metal cookware rattle softly against the stones. Aaron slowly stepped backward toward the tent while keeping his flashlight pointed toward the darkness. I grabbed another piece of wood and shoved it into the fire, forcing the flames higher. For a moment, the forest remained still, and something massive moved between the trees beyond the clearing. The beam of Aaron's flashlight caught a brief shift of darkness sliding behind one of the enormous trunks. The shape was far too large to belong to a bear. Whatever had passed behind that tree had filled nearly half the width of the trunk. A low, rumbling breath drifted from somewhere just beyond the edge of the clearing. The sound was heavy, wet, and unnervingly close. I raised my own flashlight and swept the beam across the forest, but the towering trunks created endless blind spots. Anything large enough to stay hidden behind them could move freely without fully revealing itself. Another impact shook the forest as something struck a nearby tree. Bark splintered loudly, echoing through the darkness. Aaron and I both jumped at the sound. When our flashlights swept across the trunk, fresh gouges had appeared in the bark. Deep scars ripped through the wood like the marks we had seen earlier. The creature circled closer. Could hear its movement now, heavy steps pressing into the soft forest floor, branches snapping under immense weight. The sounds moved slowly around the clearing, always just beyond the reach of our firelight. It felt like the predator was studying us, testing the perimeter of the campsite before deciding how to approach. Then a tree shook violently somewhere behind us. I spun just in time to see a massive redwood trunk shudder from the force of something colliding with it. The creature remained hidden behind the other trees, but the sheer strength behind the impact was unmistakable. Aaron whispered something under his breath that sounded very much like a prayer. The growl came again, this time from directly across the clearing. I swung my flashlight toward the sound just as a huge shape passed briefly between two redwood trunks. For a fraction of a second, the beam illuminated something covered in dark matted fur. The creature's back rose higher than the lower branches of the surrounding ferns. Then it vanished behind another tree. My heart pounded violently as I replayed the brief glimpse in my mind. Whatever had moved through the light was enormous. It's far larger than any bear I had ever seen in the wild. Aaron must have seen it too, because he slowly backed toward the tent. The forest suddenly exploded with movement. Something rushed along the edge of the clearing, snapping branches and slamming through ferns. The ground trembled beneath the heavy footfalls. The creature moved faster than anything that size should have been capable of moving through such dense forest. Aaron shouted as one of the nearby saplings snapped in half and crashed toward the campsite. We both jumped aside as the broken trunk struck the ground only a few feet from the fire. The impact scattered sparks into the air. The clearing suddenly felt far too small. Then the creature finally stepped far enough into the firelight for us to see part of it clearly. A massive arm covered in coarse, dark fur reached around a redwood trunk. The limb was thicker than my thigh. Long claws curled from the end of an enormous hand, each one reflecting the firelight like polished bone. Aaron stumbled backward in shock as the arm scraped along the tree, carving fresh grooves into the bark. The creature pulled the limb back behind the trunk before either of us could see the rest of its body, but the glimpse had been enough. Whatever was stalking us was enormous and powerful enough to tear through the forest itself. Another growl rolled across the clearing, louder than any before it. The sound came from directly behind the trees where the arm had appeared. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, and the creature stepped forward just enough for a massive silhouette to rise against the firelight. The shape towered nearly 12 feet tall, its shoulders broad enough to block part of the fire's glow. Thick fur covered its body, blending with the darkness between the redwoods. The creature never fully entered the light. Instead, it remained just beyond the flames, watching us with two faint reflections where its eyes should have been. For several long seconds, the timber stalker simply stood there at the edge of the clearing, studying us. Then it slowly stepped backward into the darkness, its enormous shape disappearing between the towering redwoods. The forest grew quiet again, leaving only the crackle of our fire and the fallen trees around us. But the deep claw marks in the trunks proved one thing with terrifying certainty. Whatever lived in this forest had only been warning us. Story 4. The trail that won't let you leave. The trail forked from the main path, marked only by a weathered, sun-bleached wooden post that bore no name. My brother Caleb spotted it while we were studying the park map at the ranger station. Most hikers ignored this section entirely, leaving it overgrown. The faint path disappeared into dense redwoods. Something about the isolation drew us in, a mixture of curiosity and the thrill of wandering where few dared to tread. As we stepped onto the narrow dirt trail, the forest seemed to close around us. Towering redwoods stretched endlessly upward, their thick trunks blotting out the sun. Moss dripped from branches like curtains, and the ground beneath our boots felt spongy with decades of fallen needles and ferns. The scent of wet earth, decomposing leaves, and cedar bark filled the air. Even distant birdsong was faint, swallowed by the shadow of the canopy. At first, the hike was uneventful. The trail twisted between massive trees, each trunk wider than a small car. Ferns pressed against our legs, brushing softly as we stepped. The quiet was almost tangible, like the forest had taken a deep breath. Caleb joked that we were the first humans to walk this path in decades, though I couldn't shake a growing feeling that something unseen was watching, waiting for us to wander too far. 20 minutes in, I stopped abruptly. Caleb's backpack lay several feet from him, leaning oddly against the base of a massive redwood. We had been adjusting the straps only seconds ago, and now the pack had moved on its own. I blinked, unsure if I'd imagined it. Caleb knelt to pick it up, brushing away damp leaves clinging to the fabric, muttering under his breath, "That's impossible." I didn't touch it. We shrugged it off as an odd coincidence. Perhaps the trail's slight slope had nudged the pack. Still, the forest around us felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were pressing inward. Branches overhead rustled despite the absence of wind. Every shadow seemed to shift when we looked away. My stomach tightened, a cold not forming. The trail ahead appeared longer, twisting unpredictably between the massive trunks. A few minutes later, a faint metallic clink sounded behind me. Caleb's water bottle had rolled off the side pocket of his backpack, bouncing across the dirt path before settling near a cluster of ferns. I froze, staring at the bottle. The clip had remained fastened. He retrieved it, shaking his head in disbelief. "How?" he whispered. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The deeper we went, the more the trail narrowed. Roots twisted across the path like natural barricades. Every step forced us to watch our footing carefully. Shadows deepened under the colossal trees, stretching and blending together. The forest smelled wetter, heavier, almost suffocating. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving everything below in a dull green twilight. The peaceful solitude I had hoped for now felt stifling and uncertain. Suddenly, a small rock bounced across the trail ahead of me, rolling once before stopping at my foot. I glanced up and down the trail, expecting to see Caleb tossing it as a joke. He looked equally puzzled. Neither of us had moved or nudged the stone. The forest seemed utterly still. Even the faint chirping of birds or rustle of squirrels was absent. Something felt off in the air around us. Before I could speak, another rock struck the dirt behind us. Caleb spun toward the source, flashlight trembling in his hand. "Did you?" he began. I shook my head. The stone had landed with a sharp crack, embedding slightly in the damp earth. There was no one in sight, no footprints, no shadow hiding behind a tree. Just the endless, unmoving redwoods and the narrow, winding trail stretching beyond our vision. A third stone flew across the trail, landing dangerously close to my foot. This one hadn't rolled, it had been thrown with force. The forest pressed in on all sides, leaves rustling faintly, but no wind stirring. Caleb grabbed my arm, eyes wide. The forest that had felt calm now radiated an invisible hostility. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow shifting against the massive trunks, made the hair on my arms rise. Caleb raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the dense ferns and moss-covered trunks. Nothing moved. The forest appeared empty, yet a palpable tension hung in the air, pressing us forward. Each footstep on the soft soil sounded louder than it should have, echoing through the narrow corridor of redwoods. The path ahead twisted unpredictably, and a deep sense of unease settled over us like a wet cloak. Another rock struck the base of a nearby tree, with a sharp crack splintering bark. Caleb jumped back, muttering, No way." I felt my pulse race as my flashlight swept across the forest, revealing nothing but enormous trunks and shadowed ferns. A snapping sound came from deeper within the trees, quick and sudden. Something or someone was moving alongside us, unseen yet unmistakably present. Branches snapped violently somewhere in the undergrowth, and several stones bounced into the trail around us. One rock hit Caleb's shoulder before rolling away. He cursed and ducked instinctively. The forest seemed alive, reacting to our presence with deliberate malice. Each sound made us flinch, each shadow seemed to stretch toward us. Our nerves bristled as if the trail itself had decided to trap us. Caleb grabbed my arm urgently. "Run!" he hissed. We bolted forward as more stones flew from the surrounding trees. Some ricocheted off the trunks. Others struck the dirt near our feet. I stumbled once, barely catching myself on a root. The narrow path felt like a gauntlet, every step placing us in the path of unseen projectiles. The forest had transformed from serene wilderness into something menacing, focused entirely on stopping us. We sprinted down the twisting trail, rocks still bouncing from the undergrowth behind us. Branches whipped past, tearing at our jackets and scratching our arms. My lungs burned with exertion, but we didn't dare slow down. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, each curve hiding new threats. Caleb glanced back briefly. The forest behind us remained a blur of redwood trunks and ferns, yet the path was littered with evidence of the poltergeist's invisible fury. We ran, boots pounding the narrow trail as rocks continued bouncing unpredictably behind us. Every step brought the sound of snapping branches closer, the forest alive with malicious energy. Caleb's backpack seemed to jerk violently against his shoulders. I stumbled on an exposed root and felt the strap of my pack tug upward, as if an invisible hand had grabbed it, forcing me forward faster than I intended. Branches snapped overhead, sending small shards of bark and leaves into the air. Another rock flew past my head, ricocheting off a tree and skidding across the dirt. Caleb yelled, ducking instinctively, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. The path narrowed further, winding between enormous trunks. Yet the poltergeist seemed determined to block every step. It wasn't random. Every obstacle, every thrown object felt deliberate, like a trap designed just for us. My pack lifted again, hovering briefly before slamming against my back. I cried out, grabbing it to stabilize myself. The sound of rushing branches and snapping twigs surrounded us on all sides. Rocks and fallen debris pelted the trail, forcing us to zigzag like prey. The narrow corridor of redwoods felt suffocating. Every step made me certain that stopping, even for a second, would be fatal. Caleb ducked as a thick branch whipped past his shoulder, snapping in two against a trunk. The air carried a metallic hiss, like nails scraping stone. I glanced toward the edge of the trail, hoping to spot a break in the forest, a clearing to reach safety. But the dense redwoods stretched endlessly in every direction. The poltergeist's presence was unmistakable, intelligent, and relentless. I stumbled again, narrowly avoiding another airborne rock. Caleb reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me forward with more force than I expected. Objects around us continued flying, whistling past our heads. A faint vibration underfoot suggested unseen weight moving along the forest floor. The trail seemed to twist unnaturally, curving back upon itself as if to trap us, despite the fact that we had memorized its turns moments ago. My flashlight's beam caught the blur of my backpack levitating beside me, spun in the air before dropping suddenly, striking the ground. Caleb ducked instinctively, shouting, "Keep moving." More rocks flew from deeper in the trees, some striking roots and scattering dirt. I realized that the poltergeist wasn't just throwing objects randomly. It was controlling the very environment to make escape nearly impossible. We ran harder, adrenaline pumping through every muscle. A large branch crashed down in front of us, forcing us to leap over it. I barely cleared it, scraping my arm against rough bark. Caleb's yells echoed through the forest, drowned immediately by the sound of snapping branches and whistling rocks. The air was filled with dust and the scent of shattered bark, mingled with the musty odor of wet soil and moss. A tree root shot upward beneath my feet, as if something had pushed it from below. I stumbled, but Caleb grabbed my arm again, steadying me. Rocks continued, pelting the trail from every direction, and my flashlight flickered against the shadowed trunks. The forest seemed infinite, a tunnel of menace stretching into darkness. The poltergeist was everywhere and nowhere at once, its presence tangible, suffocating, and inescapable. Branches tore through the path ahead, some snapping mere inches from our faces. We ducked again, zigzagged, and ran blindly. I could hear heavy impacts striking trees behind us, like giant fists pounding the forest. My lungs burned. My heart raced. Fear and instinct fused, forcing us forward. Every instinct screamed to stop, but we knew we could not. The forest had decided we were prey. Caleb screamed as a backpack lifted off the ground beside him, spinning violently before dropping with a loud thump. Rocks bounced off the trail in rapid succession, forcing us to dodge. Branches whipped at our arms, cutting through the sleeves of our jackets. The poltergeist's assault had escalated beyond anything we had imagined, each obstacle more precise than the last, as though it had learned our movement and adapted in real time. I glanced back for the first time. Trees blurred together, but nothing was visible, only debris bouncing and rocks scattering like they had minds of their own. The path twisted in a way that seemed impossible, yet somehow we followed it instinctively. Each step felt like a challenge imposed by the forest itself, the air heavy with the presence of something malicious, unseen, yet undeniably real. Finally, a faint glimmer of light appeared through the redwoods ahead the edge of the forest. The start of a service road we had noted on our map earlier. Caleb shouted with relief, urging me forward. Rocks still flew behind us, but their frequency lessened as we approached the clearing. The invisible force seemed to sense we were about to escape, yet could not reach beyond the forest's edge. We burst into the clearing, gasping, stumbling onto the dirt road. The forest loomed behind us, dark and impenetrable, yet silent for the first time since we had entered the trail. My pack sagged heavily on my shoulders, clothes torn and arms scraped. Caleb leaned against a tree at the edge of the clearing, breathing heavily, eyes wide. We were alive, but the forest had left its mark. A final rock bounced out from the forest, striking the edge of the clearing, then no more. Silence enveloped the redwoods. I looked back once, seeing only the endless wall of ancient trees. Shadows shifted slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure vanish behind a trunk. I shivered, feeling the weight of the forest's invisible gaze, even as the road underfoot promised safety. We walked briskly toward the main road, not daring to glance back again. The trail we had entered was gone from memory, as if it had never existed. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made us flinch, but we kept moving. By the time the ranger station came into view, the forest behind us looked calm, serene, as if it had never tried to trap us at all, yet the lingering dread stayed with us. Story 5. The Hollowed Giant. I had heard stories about the Hollowed Giant before entering the park. Whispers from rangers and old hikers alike. Single redwood, impossibly wide and gnarled, with a hollow that seemed dark enough to swallow a person whole. The trail leading to it was rarely used, overgrown with ferns and moss. Curiosity drew me in, despite every cautionary tale. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, heavy and ancient, carrying a tension I couldn't shake. The hollow's entrance was larger than I imagined, an arch of barked wood blackened with age. My flashlight barely illuminated the first few feet inside. Faint echo resonated from deeper within, though nothing moved. Each step felt unnaturally quiet, the floor soft with decayed wood and damp moss. I paused, listening. Something shifted in the darkness, a movement too subtle to identify, yet enough to make my heart spike with unease. As I stepped deeper, the walls of the hollow seemed to stretch and curve unnaturally. The light from outside dimmed almost immediately, absorbed by the thick, ancient wood. I noticed faint scratches along the inner bark, too high to reach from the floor, some old, some seemingly fresh. I could feel eyes on me, unseen but present, following every step. Each breath I took echoed softly, magnified in the hollow's vast interior. I continued further, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hollow twisted unexpectedly, corridors opening where they shouldn't. Branches jutted from walls like natural pillars, some low enough to bump my shoulders. Occasionally a draft carried faint whispers, unintelligible, brushing across my skin like a warning. I told myself it was the wind, nothing more. Yet every instinct screamed that this hollow was alive, aware, and watching, bending its shape around me in ways the eye couldn't perceive. After several minutes, I reached a chamber larger than any natural hollow should be. My light revealed the walls curving into arching tunnels that disappeared into blackness. The floor felt uneven, soft in some places, rigid in others, shifting subtly beneath my feet. I could hear a faint scraping sound, coming from somewhere ahead, somewhere behind, or perhaps all around. The hollow seemed infinite, its dimensions defying logic, growing larger as I ventured deeper. I paused in the center of the chamber, shining my flashlight in all directions. Every angle seemed identical, every passage blending seamlessly into another. Shadows twisted oddly, lengthening then shrinking when I moved. My pulse quickened. Something unseen watched from just beyond the reach of my light. I could feel the weight of it, patient and calculating, measuring, testing. I swallowed hard, stepping forward anyway, knowing turning back might not be possible. The air grew colder as I walked, damp mist curling around my ankles. The faint scraping returned, echoing from multiple directions at once. I tried to call out, my voice swallowed by the hollow's vastness. No reply came. The walls seemed to pulse slightly, subtle undulations that I caught only from the corner of my eye. Every step forward made the darkness feel denser, heavier, as if it pressed in, both warning me and daring me to continue. I stumbled upon a small cavity filled with moss and decomposed bark, a natural bench almost large enough to sit on. As I rested briefly, a cold breeze swept through, carrying an almost imperceptible hiss, like a whisper of warning. The walls shimmered faintly where my light hit them. I felt for the first time that the hollow itself was conscious, bending its interior, shaping its corridors, watching and waiting for me to falter. Venturing onward, I noticed the passages no longer matched the exterior tree. Corridors curved impossibly, intersecting and splitting in ways that defied the shape of the redwood. I called out again. No reply. Footsteps echoed behind me briefly, then silence. My flashlight flickered, casting long, crawling shadows along the walls. I felt as though the hollow shifted when I wasn't looking, repositioning its interior, a labyrinth that rearranged itself while I moved. A sudden scrape echoed close, just beyond my left shoulder. I spun, flashlight sweeping over the curved walls, revealing nothing. My breath hitched. The hollow pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I tried to retrace my steps, but the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, opening into new chambers I hadn't seen before. Panic bubbled beneath the surface, but I forced myself forward, knowing stopping might give whatever watched me an advantage. Every step was nerve-wracking. I felt unseen eyes following me constantly, the sensation pressing against my skin. Shadows danced where they shouldn't, and distant echoes of scraping and faint whispers made my heart pound. I wanted to turn back, but the entrance seemed farther away, almost mocking me. The hollow had trapped me inside, and it was no longer a simple tree. It was an entity, a living labyrinth of wood, infinite in scale and intent. Time lost meaning. The corridors twisted and split, some passages leading back toward where I thought I came from, others opening into chambers that defied logic. A subtle vibration ran through the floor, almost like the redwood itself was breathing. I realized then that this wasn't just a hollow. It was a predator. It watched, adapted, and waited for me to make a mistake. My flashlight beam caught tiny glints in the shadows. Eyes, perhaps, or reflections. A draft swept past me, carrying a low hiss that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I ducked instinctively as a thin branch slithered out of a nearby wall, scraping the floor as if testing my reaction. The hollow shifted again. Corridors I thought I knew disappeared, replaced by new openings. Every instinct screamed that this place was alive, conscious, and aware of my presence. I could almost hear it judging me. I pressed onward, blindly navigating the corridors, till I stumbled into a chamber that seemed impossibly vast, ceilings vanishing into darkness. I shone my light around, finding only echoes, shadows, and the faint hint of movement at the edges of my vision. I realized with growing terror that I might never leave unless the hollow allowed it. It was patient, calculating, waiting for me to panic completely. I sank briefly onto a patch of moss, trying to catch my breath. The hollow was silent for a moment, deceptively calm. My flashlight illuminated what I thought was a far wall, but as I blinked, it seemed to shift, stretching further than logic allowed. I forced myself to stand, gripping the light tightly. The redwood was no longer just a tree, it was a labyrinthine entity, ancient and conscious, testing my resolve, daring me to escape. I pressed forward, heart hammering, flashlight beam trembling with every step. The hollow's corridors had multiplied, twisting impossibly. I tried to mark my path with small scratches in the bark, but the lines seemed to vanish almost immediately. It was as if the tree was alive, reading my attempts to escape, reshaping the interior to keep me disoriented and inside its massive, watchful form. A distant scraping echoed again, closer this time. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, impossible shapes darting just beyond the flashlight's reach. My breath came in shallow gasps. Each step felt precarious, as though the floor beneath me might suddenly give way. The hollow's air was damp, carrying a faint metallic scent, sharp and chilling, like warning blood left long ago. I stumbled into a chamber that seemed to fold in on itself. Light from my flashlight reflected off slick surfaces that should not have existed, surfaces curving in impossible directions. Whispers rose faintly, unintelligible but persistent, pressing against the back of my skull. I could feel the entity's gaze tracking me from every corridor, every shadow, unseen but insistent, guiding and hurting me deeper. Panic rose as a section of floor vibrated beneath my feet. My pack lifted slightly, as if tested by some invisible hand, then dropped with a dull thud. Every instinct screamed to run, yet every corridor looped impossibly, bringing me back to the same chamber I had just left. The hollow seemed to mock me, stretching and rearranging at will, infinite and patient. A soft, scraping sound reverberated from above. The hollow ceiling, undulating subtly, shadows shifting against the wooden walls. I spun in a slow circle, but the shapes dissolved before I could focus. Each corridor I thought I recognized now looked subtly different. The angles wrong, the shadows deeper. The tree was no longer a hollow. It was a labyrinthine entity, ancient, alive, and aware of every motion. I tried to steady my breath, counting footsteps, but the echoes betrayed me. Corridors that had appeared straight now twisted and split unexpectedly. Something moved just out of reach, brushing faintly against the walls, leaving traces of damp bark and moss that I could feel more than see. The hollow seemed to anticipate my every choice, calculating, testing, its presence palpable and chilling. At one junction, the path opened into a chamber wider than any tree should contain. Shadows crept along its edges, thickening unnaturally. I shone my flashlight over every corner, catching only fleeting hints of movement, tiny glints of reflected light eyes. Vanished when I focused. The hollow's corridors seemed to pulse, stretching, bending, and guiding me toward some unknown interior center. I pressed onward, each step echoing softly. Amplified in the hollow's vastness, whispers swirled, unintelligible but urgent, brushing against my ears like warnings. The walls were slick, curving with a subtle, unnatural motion that disoriented me. My heartbeat accelerated as unseen eyes seemed to track me from every angle, every shadow, leaving me unsure whether I was moving forward or simply circling endlessly. A sudden scraping from above made me duck instinctively. Dust rained down in fine clouds, leaving a faint metallic scent in the air. My flashlight flickered as the floor seemed to shift beneath me. The hollow pulsed, alive in a way I could not explain. The labyrinth was responding to me, testing me, reshaping itself around every misstep I made, always keeping me slightly off balance. I stumbled over an uneven section of floor, my flashlight swinging wildly. A chill ran along my spine as I realized the corridors had once again looped me back to a chamber I recognized. The walls were impossibly higher now, curves exaggerated, shadows deeper. Something unseen pressed from all sides, guiding, hurting, watching. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to keep moving. Sweat poured down my face as I navigated yet another twisting corridor. Whispers rose, more insistent now, merging into a low hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. Every attempt to mark my path failed. The hollow's interior shifted subtly while I moved, turning dead ends into passages, chambers into loops. The redwood was no longer just a tree. It was a sentient prison. Finally, I noticed a faint glimmer of daylight through a narrow crack ahead. Relief surged, though I remained cautious. Rocks and splinters shifted subtly beneath my feet, as though testing me, threatening to pull me back. The hollow seemed to resist, yet could not hold me against the edge of its massive form. One more step, and I felt the air outside, cooler and lighter. I stumbled through the final corridor, stepping into the sunlight spilling from the hollow's opening. The outside air felt like a bomb on my burning lungs. Behind me, the tree's interior seemed impossibly still, quiet, as though waiting for the next visitor. I shivered, sensing that the entity's gaze lingered even beyond the physical barrier. The forest around the hollow seemed serene, impossibly calm, Yet the memory of unseen eyes, shifting corridors, and whispered warnings would linger forever. I escaped, but the hollow had imprinted itself in my mind. I stepped away from the base of the giant redwood, moving slowly back to the main trail. Every glance behind revealed only the vast, silent redwoods, yet I could feel the weight of that hollowed labyrinth pressing in. The entity remained unseen, but its presence endured. I vowed never to return, carrying the lingering dread of a tree that was alive, infinite, and fully aware of its prey. Story 6. The Lanterns of the Lost. I reached the trail just before sunset, when the redwood canopy turned the forest dim and blue. The air smelled of wet bark, moss, and cold earth that never seemed to dry beneath the towering trees. I had chosen this route because it was supposed to be quiet and rarely used. The ranger at the entrance mentioned hikers disappearing here years ago, but he spoke casually enough that I didn't think much about it. The trail wound between enormous redwoods whose trunks were wider than small houses. Their branches formed a ceiling so high, it felt like walking through the pillars of some ancient cathedral. Every sound carried strangely in the forest. My footsteps echoed softly on the damp soil, while distant creaks from the trees drifted through the quiet. That was when I saw the first lantern glowing faintly between two massive trunks ahead. It hung from a crooked branch beside the trail, swaying gently, even though the air around me was completely still. The lantern looked old, its metal frame rusted and dark with age. Inside it burned a weak orange flame. I stepped closer, expecting to find a nearby campsite or some sign of another hiker. But there was nothing around it except silent forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. I assumed someone had left it behind to mark the trail. Still, something about the lantern felt strange. The flame burned steadily without smoke, and the glass looked perfectly clean despite the rust covering the frame. When I reached up and touched the handle, the metal felt unnaturally cold against my fingers. I pulled my hand back quickly as a faint second glow appeared deeper along the trail ahead. Another lantern flickered farther down the path, hanging between two redwoods like a distant guidepost. The sun was already dropping behind the hills, and shadows stretched longer across the forest floor. Curiosity pushed me forward despite the uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. The second lantern grew brighter as I approached, illuminating a small clearing beside the trail where someone had once set up camp. A ring of stones marked an old fire pit filled with damp ash. Nearby, a torn sleeping bag lay half buried beneath moss and fallen needles. A dented cooking pot rested beside a log, tipped on its side as if it had been dropped in a hurry. Everything looked abandoned for years, yet the lantern hanging above the clearing burned as if someone had lit it only moments earlier. A strange weight settled in my chest as I studied the campsite. Whoever had been here hadn't packed properly. Gear was scattered in random places like people had left quickly without thinking. I circled the clearing slowly, searching for footprints or tracks in the soil. But the forest floor was soft with moss and needles. It had swallowed every trace of whoever once stayed here. Then I noticed movement near the fire ring. At first I thought it was smoke rising from the ashes, but the shape slowly formed into the outline of a person kneeling beside the stones. The figure flickered faintly like heat distortion above pavement. It reached toward the ground again and again, repeating the same motion endlessly as if trapped inside a moment that refused to fade. While backing away from the clearing, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The lantern's glow wasn't random or decorative, pointed straight along the trail like a marker guiding travelers deeper into the woods. When I looked ahead, another faint orange light burned between the trees. It hung perfectly still in the growing darkness, waiting there like a signal meant for someone to follow. I decided to turn back toward the trailhead, but the forest behind me already looked different. The shadows were thicker, swallowing the spaces between the enormous trunks. Through the darkness, I could still see the lanterns I had already passed glowing faintly along the path. Their lights seemed closer together now. Instead of guiding the trail, they felt more like markers outlining something hidden within the woods. The thought unsettled me enough that I kept walking forward instead of back. The next lantern hung above a narrow bend in the trail where the trees crowded close together. Beneath it sat another campsite, and this one looked far newer than the others. A large backpack rested against a tree trunk with its zipper half open, as if someone had searched through it quickly. A pair of boots lay beside a fire pit that still held gray ash beneath a thin layer of pine needles. The clearing felt colder than the surrounding forest. As I stepped into the lantern's glow, faint shapes began forming around the campsite. At first, they looked like shadows stretching across the ground, but they slowly sharpened into 3 human figures moving near the fire ring. The hikers moved frantically, their gestures sharp and desperate, though no voices carried through the quiet forest. One figure knelt beside a pack, while another paced in tight circles near the trees. Their bodies flickered like reflections in disturbed water. The panic in their movements felt painfully real. It looked like they were packing in a hurry while watching the forest for something approaching. One of the figures suddenly turned and pointed toward the dark forest beyond the clearing. The others followed his gaze immediately. Instinctively, I looked in the same direction. For several seconds, I saw nothing except towering redwoods in deep shadows. Then a lantern farther in the forest flared brighter than the rest. The ghostly hikers reacted instantly, scrambling to grab gear scattered across the ground. As they moved, one of the hikers froze and slowly turned his head toward me. His expression twisted with sudden recognition. The others followed his stare moments later. One raised a shaking hand and pointed past me, toward the lanterns lining the trail behind. His head moved desperately from side to side as if warning me not to go back. Then the forest behind me shifted. The movement behind me was subtle at first, a faint shifting sound like boots pressing into damp soil. I turned slowly, expecting to see nothing but trees and lanterns. Instead, shapes stood between the lights lining the trail. At least a dozen figures had appeared where the lanterns hung. They stood quietly among the redwoods, their forms pale and uneven, watching me with a stillness that felt far too deliberate. As the lantern flames flickered brighter, the faces of those figures slowly became clearer. Some looked hollow and distant, their bodies blurred like the earlier scenes replaying themselves. Others looked aware, their eyes fixed on me with sharp attention. A man near the closest lantern lifted his arm slowly and pointed in my direction, his gesture drawing the focus of every other figure standing among the lights. Behind me, the 3 hikers in the clearing had stopped their frantic movements entirely. I could feel their attention pressing against my back like heat from a nearby fire. When I glanced over my shoulder, they were staring directly at me. The fear that had driven their earlier actions had vanished. In its place was something heavier, something disturbingly close to expectation. One of them stepped toward me. His movement was careful, almost hesitant at first. As he crossed deeper into the lantern's glow, his form sharpened into something nearly solid. Dirt streaked his clothes, and exhaustion hollowed his face. He raised a trembling hand as if asking for help, but before he could come closer, the lantern above him flared brighter, its flames stretching unnaturally high. The moment the light intensified, the man froze mid-step. His body stiffened as though something unseen had caught hold of him. Slowly, he turned his head away from me and looked past my shoulder toward the lanterns along the trail. I followed his gaze again. The figures standing beside those lights had begun moving forward, closing the distance between us with quiet, patient steps. That was when fear finally pushed me into motion. I turned and ran down the trail, leaving the clearing behind. The lanterns blurred past as I rushed through the forest. Each light revealed another silent figure waiting nearby. Some reached toward me weakly as I passed them. Others simply watched with hollow expressions, their stillness suggesting they had seen this moment play out many times before. The trail twisted between enormous redwoods, whose trunks blocked what little twilight remained in the sky. My breath grew ragged as I ran, but the lanterns kept appearing ahead of me, no matter how far I went. Another orange glow waited deeper in the woods. The pattern felt deliberate now, as if the lights were guiding me through a corridor built slowly through the forest. When I finally slowed to catch my breath, something about the next lantern caught my attention immediately. It looked different from the others. The metal frame was cleaner, and the glass wasn't clouded with age. The flame burned brighter, steadier. As I stepped closer, I realized the lantern wasn't hanging from a natural branch like the rest. It had been tied there with fresh rope. Beneath that lantern stood another figure, barely visible in the darkness beyond the light. Unlike the others, this man looked almost completely solid. His hiking jacket was modern, his pack still slung over one shoulder. When he noticed me staring, relief flashed across his face, shook his head urgently and mouthed silent words I couldn't hear through the heavy stillness of the forest. Then he pointed behind me. I turned just long enough to see the figures from the clearing emerging onto the trail. They were moving faster now, no longer cautious. Their pace carried a desperate urgency that made my chest tighten. The man beneath the lantern grabbed the rope above him and tugged at it uselessly, panic flooding his face as if he understood something I had only begun to realize. Each lantern marked a place where someone had been taken. The scenes I had witnessed earlier weren't simply memories replaying themselves. The hikers trapped beside those lights were waiting for something to replace them. When another traveler followed the lanterns far enough into the forest, one of the trapped souls could leave. The lantern stayed behind, burning quietly to guide the next person into the same path. The man beneath the lantern stepped closer to me, reaching forward with trembling hands. His fingers stopped inches from my jacket as though pressing against invisible glass. The lantern above him flickered violently, reacting to his struggle. Behind me, the approaching figures stretched out their arms in the same desperate way, their expressions shifting between hope and hunger. I forced myself to run again, ignoring the desperate voices forming in my head as the forest rushed past. This time the lanterns began thinning the farther I went. Their orange glow faded one by one behind me until only darkness and towering redwoods filled the trail ahead. After several long minutes, the forest opened slightly, allowing faint moonlight to reach the ground. When I finally dared to look back, the lanterns remained far behind me. Their glow formed a crooked line winding deep into the forest. Figures moved slowly between the lights, but none crossed the space where the final lantern hung. They simply stood there watching, silent and motionless beneath the towering trees as the wind stirred the high branches above them. I didn't stop walking until the trailhead lights appeared through the trees hours later. The parking lot was nearly empty, the ranger station dark. As I drove away from the forest, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Somewhere along that trail, a lantern now burned with fresh rope tied to its handle. Eventually, another traveler would see it glowing in the dark. Story 7. The Screaming Timber. I thought I understood the forest after 3 weeks patrolling the trails of Redwood National Park. The trees towered like ancient guardians, their trunks swallowing the horizon and twisting the paths into impossible angles. Even the air felt heavy, carrying sounds that ricocheted oddly through bark and moss. Rangers joked about the forest talking, but I treated it as a story meant to scare new volunteers. I never expected I'd hear the forest speak my name. The first scream ripped through the night just after midnight. I was sitting outside the ranger cabin, finishing paperwork, when a high, desperate cry pierced the trees. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the usual animal noises. You're at a human edge, a raw panic that froze me in place. Heart hammering, I grabbed my flashlight and radio, rushing toward the sound. Injured hikers weren't unusual, but nothing could have prepared me for this. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks that seemed older than time itself. The branches above interlaced so densely the night sky vanished completely. I moved cautiously, every snap of leaves or cracking branch setting me on edge. The scream had stopped once I began walking, leaving only scattered noises. Thumps in the distance, twigs breaking under some unseen weight. The forest was watching, and every sound made my nerves tighten like steel. Then the scream returned, closer this time, twisting and warping as it echoed. I swung my flashlight toward the black void ahead. The sound started like a human voice but ended as something distorted, warped, like a recording played through broken speakers. My fingers gripped the radio as I reported a possible injured visitor near the old maintenance trail, though unease coiled in my chest. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Dispatch replied with confusion. No hikers were scheduled in this section, and the nearest campsite lay miles away. My radio crackled again, cutting through static, when another voice erupted deeper in the forest. Help. My blood ran cold. It sounded exactly like Ranger Delgado, my supervisor, stationed 30 miles away at headquarters. My pulse spiked, and I froze. If it was Delgado's voice, it wasn't him. Something else was doing this. Something alive. I called out his name, my voice quivering. Silence answered, then branches snapped violently somewhere ahead. The noise traveled unnaturally fast, as if some enormous thing was moving through the treetops without touching the ground. I advanced cautiously, flashlight sweeping over the thick trunks. Every few seconds, Another voice burst from the darkness, shouts, screams, each uncannily human. My heart pounded as I realized these weren't echoes. Something was mimicking life itself, feeding on panic. A woman screamed next, then a child. My legs froze. No group of hikers could have made so many voices appear from every direction so quickly. They overlapped, twisting, echoing, impossible to pinpoint. The radio hissed, static swallowing my words, while yet another scream erupted from the canopy above. It vibrated through the bark, rattling my teeth. The forest felt crowded, alive with voices. Yet I couldn't see a single person. I was utterly alone, or so I thought. My flashlight hit a broken branch lying across the trail. Fresh splinters told me it hadn't fallen naturally. I crouched, heart hammering, and realized the branch had been snapped nearly 12 feet above the ground. Whatever did this had reached far beyond any normal animal. I shivered as another scream erupted behind me, sharp and terrifying. My instincts screamed to run, but the curiosity, the horror rooted me in place. I had to know what hunted the treetops. I spun around, flashlight slipping from my grip. It rolled across the dirt before catching against a trunk. I froze, staring into darkness, heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then the voice returned. Marcus. My name. I recognized it instantly. My younger brother's voice. He had died 5 years ago in a car accident. My throat went dry. I whispered his name, but the forest only repeated it, stretching his voice across the trunks like a cruel echo, something unnatural, imitating memory. I forced myself to breathe, gripping my flashlight with trembling hands. No recording, no trick, no lost hiker could reproduce something so personal. Yet his voice rose again. Marcus, help me. It drifted upward, floating above me. My light shot into the canopy, searching for movement. The branches shook, shadows flickered. I felt the air itself bend around me. Something enormous moved through the trees, and every vibration carried stolen voices, feeding the forest's terror, collecting every scream it could find. My beam climbed tangled branches and vanished into darkness. Something moved far above, too quick and massive to see clearly. Limbs shook violently, snapping branches that rained down around me. Then the screaming began anew, not one voice, but dozens, layered, overlapping, unrelenting. The forest roared with panic, each cry stretching into the next. My knees buckled, and I realized the treetops themselves were alive with imitation. It wasn't just a creature, it was the forest wearing our fear. I stumbled backward toward the trail, senses screaming at me. The voices shifted again, changing from pleas for help into arguments. Muttered conversations, even static-filled radio chatter, some repeated endlessly, like cursed loops trapped in the canopy. I froze, realizing that wherever this thing moved, the sound followed. Every step I took, it mimicked me, taunted me, copied the panic in my chest. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The forest had become a trap of sound. I reached the trail marker, relief briefly surging through me. Then a massive branch exploded across the path ahead. Splinters showered my boots as I stumbled back. Something enormous had landed somewhere in the trees beyond the trail, shaking trunks that weighed tons. Another human scream tore across the forest instantly afterward. I froze, heart hammering. That voice, it was mine. My terrified shout echoed endlessly, layered through dozens of voices. The forest had stolen me, or at least my sound. I covered my mouth, horror clawing my chest, as the scream repeated, louder this time. Dozens of versions of my voice rang out in every direction, bouncing through the treetops. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. The thing above wasn't just copying voices, it was collecting them. Every word, every scream, every heartbeat of fear. I could feel it absorbing panic like sunlight, twisting it, reshaping it, until the forest itself became a predator. Branches above me exploded apart violently. I lifted my flashlight just in time to see a long-limbed shape sliding across the canopy, moving with impossible speed. Its limbs wrapped around trunks like living vines, carrying what looked like a body too large to move so easily. It screamed, merging dozens of stolen voices into one horrifying chorus. Then the forest answered, echoing that sound in every tree, in every shadow, swallowing me in a symphony of terror. I stumbled backward, roots tangling my boots as something above me moved impossibly fast. Its long limbs wrapped around massive trunks, slipping through shadows. The forest vibrated with stolen voices pressing against my chest. I tried to breathe, but every heartbeat echoed in sync with the creature's rhythm. Each whisper of the trees taunted me, making me feel small, prey, exposed, trapped beneath its terrifying canopy. I forced myself to run, but the forest twisted endlessly ahead. Every step brought another scream, an echo of someone I knew, warped and distorted. Shadows slid along branches like living things, moving with intent. I realized it wasn't just copying voices, it was anticipating fear, feeding on it in real time. My chest tightened, my limbs trembling. I understood I had become part of its collection, a sound among hundreds. A crash above sent my flashlight spinning, caught it pointing upward, and saw something enormous, half human, half tree, limbs writhing grotesquely, carried a body dangling like a puppet. My stomach heaved. These screams weren't random, they were trophies woven into the forest itself. Every distortion, every echo, warned me I could become next. Survival felt impossible as terror rippled through the air, binding me to the creature's presence. I called for help, but my voice vanished into the chorus. It responded instantly, layering my words with dozens of others, indistinguishable from one another. The forest moved with it, limbs swinging, trunks creaking. Shadows shifted around me, and I realized I was trapped in a living nightmare. It didn't just imitate us, it learned, it predicted. My terror had become part of the forest, feeding its hunt and strengthening its presence. Branches whipped my face as I bolted deeper. Roots snagged my boots, and every step echoed with stolen voices. I glimpsed the creature leaping between trees, limbs stretching unnaturally. The forest itself seemed alive, vibrating with panic and stolen cries, including my own. Fear became rhythm, each heartbeat synchronized to the forest's pulse. Every sound marked me, every rustle reminded me I was prey at the center of something monstrous and ancient. I stumbled into a clearing, but shadows twisted unnaturally between massive trunks. Shapes hung suspended, bodies contorted like part of the canopy itself. I gagged, trying not to look, but the forest drew me in. Every stolen voice tethered me to the horror above, anchoring me to the scene. I couldn't escape. I was both spectator and prey, trapped in a symphony of screams that seemed alive, aware, and infinitely patient. I crouched behind a massive trunk, flashlight trembling. Above, it moved methodically, wrapping limbs around trunks with terrifying precision. Voices surged into a discordant chorus, including mine. I couldn't flee or hide, every sound I made fed it. The forest had become predator and trap. Pressing against rough bark, I tried to shrink, to disappear. My mind raced, trying to find an opening, any gap in its attention, but the canopy's shadows held me. Time lost meaning beneath the canopy. The chorus ebbed and surged, voices looping endlessly. Shadows twisted, multiple forms moving like extensions of the creature. It circled me, testing boundaries, teaching me its rhythm. I couldn't escape, only luck might spare me. Distraction or a narrow opening, each heartbeat, each breath synchronized with the forest's predatory pulse, reminding me it had already studied me, predicted my terror, and stored it. A low rumble shook the ground. The creature froze, mid-leap, limbs coiling, and the chorus warped into a low, discordant hum. I bolted, sprinting down a narrow path between trees. Branches slapped my face, roots tore at my boots, but I didn't stop. The hum followed, a symphony of terror riding every movement. The first time I glimpsed hope, if only fleeting, fragile, but I had to reach the forest's edge before it reclaimed me. I burst into thinner woods, chest burning, lungs aflame. Every nerve screamed danger. Stolen voices whispered, merging with my own panic. Glancing back, the forest seemed serene, but I knew better. Somewhere in those redwoods, it waited. I had survived, barely. Yet the echoes followed me, rattling my mind. A reminder that nothing truly escapes this forest, kept pieces of its prey long after the night ends. I collapsed against a trail sign, shivering and gasping. Sunlight spilled over the treetops, but the forest still pulsed with voices. Delgado's voice, my brother's, countless others, lingered in the underbrush. No one would believe it. I had no proof, no records of what happened. My mind replayed every scream, every twisted echo. The forest had claimed more than bodies. It had taken memories, terror, and fragments of my soul, leaving me shaken and hollow. I walked the remaining mile out, cautious, glancing at every shadow. The forest loomed behind, alive even in apparent silence. I dared not speak aloud. My own voice felt borrowed, part of the chorus I had escaped. Every rustle reminded me it hadn't gone, simply paused, gathering, observing, waiting for the next unwary soul. I survived, but the Redwoods had collected a piece of me, something I would never retrieve. Reporting to headquarters, my words trembled. Staff accepted my story of missing hikers and exhaustion, but I could not reveal the truth. Who would believe a forest that screams with human voices, that devours terror like fuel? Writing this now, I still hear echoes in my mind. Every scream of that night plays behind my eyes, reminding me that the forest is immortal, patient, and hungry. I survived, but I am forever changed. Story 8. The Root Faces. I thought a weekend in Redwood National Park would be peaceful, a break from the city. The campsite was quiet, nestled among towering trunks and thick moss. Birds called in the morning light, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. We set up tents, stacked firewood, and laughed over minor frustrations. I didn't notice the way shadows clung unnaturally to the tree roots, like something was watching, waiting, already aware we were here. That first night, I noticed it. Faces just hints at first emerging from the bark near our tents. Pale, twisted, features flickering in the firelight. I blinked, certain it was smoke or a trick of my eyes, but every glance revealed the same grotesque shapes staring back. The others laughed nervously, calling it imagination. I wanted to believe them, but the faces shifted as we moved, stretching and scowling in ways that were too deliberate to be natural. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the faces returned. Some were twisted in terror, others in rage. I felt their eyes following me even when I left the tent to relieve myself. The wind carried whispers, or something like whispers, that seemed to slip beneath my skin. I tried to tell myself it was fear, the isolation playing tricks on me. But then, something on the campsite moved on its own, a lantern tipping violently without cause. A sudden crash made me jump. The lantern rolled across the dirt, sparks flying from its base. The others stirred, murmuring in half-awake confusion. My pulse raced as I noticed other items. Mugs lifted slightly, rocks shifting positions, and sticks thrown toward the tents. Nothing touched them, yet everything moved. I stepped closer to the fire, hoping for some rational explanation, but the faces in the bark seemed to grin wider, their lips stretching impossibly as if mocking our confusion. The wind died suddenly. The forest went still. Every creature paused. Then the faces multiplied. Roots cracked, bark peeled back, revealing entire panels of twisted human likenesses, eyes wet and glimmering. They didn't scream, yet I felt their terror pressing directly into my chest. My friends froze as well, staring at the grotesque spectacle. Fear gnawed at me. Something ancient and hateful was in the wood. The campsite no longer felt like our own, it was already theirs. I backed away, heart hammering, but the roots beneath my feet shifted as if reaching for me. Every move I made caused a ripple through the ground, a series of subtle cracks that revealed more faces. They turned, following me, mouths stretching open in silent howls. I realized I could not outrun them. They were everywhere, embedded in every tree and root. My hands shook as I tried to keep the fire between us, but the faces multiplied with every heartbeat. One of the tents shuddered violently. I ran toward it, expecting someone inside, only to find it empty. The poles bent inward like iron traps, fabric writhing as if alive. I grabbed the other's shoulders, shaking them awake. "Do you see this?" I whispered, voice trembling. They nodded, terrified, confirming what I already feared. Objects weren't just moving, they were attacking, guided by the forest's will. Rocks ricocheted, mugs spun in the air, sticks jabbed at our ankles. We tried to gather our gear, but every step was sabotaged. Roots snapped underfoot, grabbing boots and tripping us. Firewood leapt from the stack, forming barriers between us. Faces pressed against every tree we approached, screaming silently in unison. I could feel their eyes boring into my skin, judging, mocking. The forest had transformed into a cage, alive and malevolent, orchestrating chaos in every direction. Panic clawed at me, but we forced ourselves forward, toward the edge of the campsite. I tripped over a root and landed hard, face inches from a grotesque visage embedded in the bark. It was screaming without sound, eyes wet and staring directly at me. I recoiled, scrambling back, but the forest had already extended its grasp. Twigs snapped around me as if swatting my hands away. The wind carried a faint, mocking laughter, blending with the silent screams. I realized the poltergeist wasn't invisible. It was the forest itself, every root, branch, and face, acting in unison to trap us. The fire flickered dangerously as objects moved with increasing speed. Mugs flew from tables, hitting the ground with explosive force. Rocks bounced off tree trunks toward us. My friends shouted, trying to dodge, but the forest anticipated our movements. Every glance revealed another face in the bark, another root twisting toward us. It was as if the forest had memorized every step we took, waiting to punish hesitation. I felt trapped, overwhelmed, and utterly helpless in the heart of the redwoods. I screamed, trying to rally the others, but my voice felt swallowed, muffled by the dense trees. The silent faces multiplied faster, now crawling along the trunks, staring from impossible angles. I could see glimpses of hikers we knew, or thought we knew, embedded in the roots. Their eyes were empty, mouths open in wordless terror. I staggered back, firelight dancing across bark that felt too human, too alive. Every object, every shadow was poised to strike, controlled by something unseen and intelligent. A lantern crashed near my foot, sparks burning my skin. I jumped back, barely avoiding shards of glass. The forest seemed to pulse with intent, roots slithering, sticks snapping violently in every direction. Faces appeared in the firelight, moving as though laughing, screaming, and mocking simultaneously. I grabbed my friends, forcing them toward the path out of the campsite. Each step became a battle against roots twisting beneath our boots, objects flying with purpose. The forest had become a weapon, directed at us alone. Branches whipped my face as I ran blindly toward a faint trail. Faces pressed against every trunk, watching, twisting impossibly. Rocks and firewood blocked the path, forcing me to dodge and leap. The forest's assault intensified. Every root, every face, every branch seemed aware of my panic, feeding off it. I could hear the faint, inaudible screams multiplying around me, filling the night with pressure. The poltergeist was patient, relentless, and terrifyingly intelligent. Escape felt impossible, yet I forced my legs to carry me forward. We reached a small clearing, but the terror followed. Faces emerged from the ground, the bark, every root around us. One twisted visage lifted from the soil, inches from my face. I stumbled back, nearly falling, heart hammering, breath ragged. Objects flew past, stones, sticks. Even our backpacks launched as if thrown by invisible hands. The redwoods no longer felt like trees. They were sentient, hostile, and unyielding. I realized then that only one thing could save us: finding the edge of this cursed campsite. The path out was jagged, tangled with roots reaching up like grasping hands. Faces appeared at every turn, contorted in anguish, rage, and mockery. We ran narrowly, dodging branches that swung with lethal force. Every glance revealed more faces embedded in roots and bark, silent screams haunting our ears. I forced my shaking legs forward, ignoring pain, ignoring exhaustion. Behind us, the campsite erupted in chaos, objects flying and roots thrashing. The forest itself seemed to be aware we were escaping. I stumbled onto the narrow trail leading from the campsite, roots tangling my boots with every step. The forest pulsed behind us, alive with faces pressed into bark and soil. Rocks and sticks shot from hidden angles, narrowly missing us. Dozens of eyes followed our movement, mocking, aware. The forest wasn't just watching, it was hunting. Panic surged, but we forced our feet forward, step by step, toward escape. Branches whipped my face as we ran. Lanterns tumbled from the campsite, crashing into trunks, illuminating faces that hadn't been there before. They twisted, gaped, and stared with impossible awareness. Every root tried to trip us. Sticks jabbed at our legs. My friends clung to me, dragging each other forward. The forest orchestrated the chaos, punishing hesitation, feeding on our fear. relentless in its intelligence and intent. A branch swung down. I ducked just in time. Faces emerged from roots, pale and wet-eyed, mouths frozen in silent screams. The forest was weaponizing terror, projecting it into us. Every object, every root, obeyed unseen intelligence. The line between animate and inanimate vanished, was alive, hunting, and we were prey. I forced my legs to move faster, lungs burning, heart hammering, each step a desperate attempt to outrun the nightmare. Wind knocked me off balance, sending me sprawling across dirt. Whispers behind me sounded like warped, accusing voices of my friends. Roots rose to snag us. Sticks jabbed with precision. Every glance revealed another face, grotesque and mocking. Hesitation would mean being claimed. Forward motion became the only choice. I forced my lungs to expand, heart thrumming violently, legs carrying us toward a faint glow, the edge of the forest. Roots coiled beneath our feet. Rocks ricocheted across the trail. Faces twisted in bark and soil, stretching impossibly, staring with wet, empty eyes. Lanterns toppled inches from our heads. The forest pulsed with intent, measuring our fear. Every dodge and leap was anticipated. My friend's hands clung to mine as we ran. Survival demanded focus, ignoring pain, ignoring exhaustion. Only one goal mattered: escape. Only one chance remained: move forward without pause. Branches lashed sideways, catching hair and jackets. Faces pressed from every trunk, crawling, mouths opening in silent agony. The forest had become a predator, each root, branch, and object alive and hostile. Step by step, we advanced, adrenaline and panic driving us through chaos. The trail ahead became our lifeline, the forest's traps endless, intelligent, unyielding. I pushed my legs to their limits, forcing my mind to ignore the screaming faces and hidden threats. A root shot up, snagging my boot. I yanked it free, scrambling forward. One face mirrored a missing hiker, mouth frozen in terror, eyes wet and wide. The forest weaponized memory as much as flesh, each visage a reminder of what awaited hesitation. I stumbled, but kept moving. The forest's intelligence was absolute. Everything obeyed its will. The line between predator and landscape had disappeared, leaving us only one option: reach the trail's edge. The canopy thickened overhead, shadows pooling with every step. Eyes followed us, countless and patient. Rocks skipped from hidden roots, sticks swung with precision. Fatigue gnawed at me, but I ignored it. Faces multiplied, emerging from bark and soil, mocking, silent, relentless. Every step was anticipated. The forest measured our fear, guiding its assaults with intelligence. Only forward motion would carry us past the cursed ground. Only escape could end the assault. A lantern rolled toward me. I jumped aside, heart hammering. Faces emerged in firelight, twisting, gaping, mouths opening in impossible synchronization. The forest pressed in, orchestrating every movement, herding us toward the edge. Objects flew, roots twisted, blocking retreat. I forced myself to ignore terror and exhaustion, focusing on each footfall. Step by step, we moved through the chaos, each motion inching us closer to survival. Branches tore at my jacket. Rocks ricocheted dangerously close. The trail's faint glow beckoned. Faces in bark and roots pressed at the edges, but we moved relentlessly. Every obstacle was designed to delay, every object a weapon. Adrenaline pushed us forward. Lungs burned, muscles screamed, but the boundary of the forest was near. The cursed campsite's grip weakened with each step. Escape was possible, but only if we kept moving. Roots snapped beneath our boots as we neared the clearing. Faces emerged, contorted in anguish, mouths open mid-scream. I leaped over one snaking root, dragging my friends. Each step toward the open ground brought relief. The forest pressed, aware, but we refused to falter. Its intelligence tested every movement, every heartbeat. One final push carried us beyond the cursed center of the campsite. We emerged into a thinning stretch, moonlight illuminating the trailhead. The faces pressed at the edges, twisting, yet the open ground allowed movement. We didn't stop. The forest recoiled, objects falling harmlessly behind us. Roots and branches twisted back into place. The silent screams faded. We were almost free, the poltergeist forest unable to follow beyond its cursed perimeter. Hope surged, tempered by exhaustion and lingering dread. One last root tried to snare my ankle. I vaulted past it, landing hard on dirt beyond the forest line. The faces shrank into bark and soil. Objects stopped moving. The forest's assault ended at the edge. Its sentience could not reach beyond. Every breath was ragged, muscles trembling, but safety was near. The campsite lay behind us, chaotic yet unreachable. The horror's grip loosened, leaving only silence in the memory of its intelligence. The moonlight hit our faces fully, the trailhead clear. No objects moved, no faces pressed forward. I sank to my knees, chest heaving, shaking uncontrollably. The redwoods loomed behind, silent, watching, waiting, their hunger contained within the forest. I dared not look back for long. The poltergeist, the faces, the moving roots, they remained behind, trapped within the redwoods canopy. We had survived, and the night was over. Story 9. The Forgotten Grove. I had wandered farther than I realized, following a faint trail through the redwood canopy. Sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and the air smelled of damp moss and ancient earth. Birds were absent, the silence pressed on me. Then I saw it, a narrow path veiled by ferns, almost hidden. Curiosity pushed me forward, my boots crunching on soft needles. There was something compelling about the grove, though I couldn't name it yet. The ground changed as I stepped into the grove. Ash and cinders littered the soil, cold, gray, and still smoking in places despite the decades that had passed. Stones and wooden planks bore markings, faint carvings I could barely make out. My fingers traced the grooves, names, dates, and symbols of violence. I shivered. The air felt thick, heavy, almost alive. Something unseen seemed to stir at the edges of the grove, watching my intrusion. I paused to take it all in. The grove was small, enclosed by towering trunks and twisted roots. A circle of stones formed what must have been an old fire pit. Smoke curled faintly as if reluctant to leave. Shadows shifted unnaturally across the trees, elongated and bending toward the center. My pulse quickened, but I pressed forward. Every instinct told me to leave, yet fascination and fear intertwined, holding me in place like invisible hands. Then I saw them, figures translucent and wavering. Moving near the edges of the clearing, their movements were almost ritualistic, and I froze. I could see glimpses of their eyes, pale and hollow, watching one another as if performing a scene from long ago. My breath caught. I wanted to look away, but something compelled me to observe. The grove wasn't empty. It had never truly been empty. The past was playing itself out before me. I tried to step back, but the forest seemed to respond. Roots and low branches shifted subtly, guiding me forward. The figures repeated a motion I couldn't yet understand, hands raising, lowering, striking in perfect rhythm. The carvings on stones and wood appeared to glow faintly as though in recognition. I whispered to myself that this was just a trick of light, yet the temperature dropped, and the sense of watching intensified. Something ancient had awoken at my presence. One figure turned toward me suddenly. Its face was blurred, as if memory and shadow combined. I froze, certain it had noticed me, though it made no sound. Around me, the carvings seemed to pulse, repeating names I couldn't read aloud without fear. The grove's energy pressed on my chest, tightening with every second. I realized I had crossed an invisible line. The spirits weren't just replaying history. They were aware of intruders, and I was the target. A wooden plank shifted at my feet, scraping against stone with a metallic screech. I jumped back, stumbling, and the figure flickered, stretching unnaturally before resuming its motion. Others appeared closer, indistinct, but growing sharper in outline. Their actions repeated with increasing speed, and the carved symbols seemed to animate, throwing shadows in all directions. My pulse raced, and I could feel a rhythm to the apparitions' movements, as if the grove itself were controlling their ghostly performance. The air vibrated, carrying whispers too soft to fully understand. I strained to hear words, fragments of screams, commands, and warnings, but the messages blurred together. Each step I took seemed mirrored by the figure's movements. The fire pit stones radiated an unsettling warmth, the carvings almost glowing under the shifting light. My hands shook, and I realized the grove wasn't passive. It demanded attention or risk becoming part of the scene. I tried to retreat, but the path back seemed altered. Roots had shifted, branches bent in strange angles, guiding me toward the center. The figure's gestures accelerated, repeating a violent sequence I could barely follow. Shadows stretched across the trees, joining the phantoms in their silent performance. My stomach churned. The carvings on the stones and planks seemed to pulse with each motion, casting distorted reflections across the clearing. I was trapped, caught in a choreography I didn't understand. A sudden gust rustled the canopy overhead. One figure raised its hands as if conducting unseen forces. I noticed names etched into the wood that matched the faces in the shadows. Each symbol seemed alive, trembling as though the spirits drew power from it. My friends, or anyone who had ever dared enter, were whispered in memory, warnings carved and replayed endlessly. The grove was a stage 4 remembrance in retribution, and I had stepped directly onto it. I stumbled over a gnarled root, falling hard. The figures flickered closer, mirrored by shadows that twisted around the trees. Every instinct screamed to flee, but I had nowhere safe to go. The carvings seemed to shift when I glanced away, sending ripples across stone and wood. Cold fingers of air brushed my neck, though no wind existed. I realized then the grove punished observation as much as intrusion. Every eye and hand seemed designed to intimidate and trap. The figures reenacted the same sequence repeatedly, faster each time. One raised a weapon, a branch, a stick. I couldn't be sure against a phantom I thought I recognized. The reenactment of violence sent a chill through me. Every step I took was mirrored, every glance anticipated. The grove spirits weren't passive observers. They were active guardians, warning intruders away from the site or marking them for disappearance. My heart raced. The sense of imminent danger was undeniable. I whispered, almost praying for some guidance. But the forest answered only with echoes of the past. The carving's glow intensified, shadows leaping like living things. Each figure turned slowly, faces twisted in silent screams, eyes hollow and accusing. My boots sank slightly into ash as though resisting movement. I had to stay in motion, even as every nerve told me to stop, yet moving meant following the spirit's choreography, their rules, or risk joining the reenactment. Branches whipped my face as I lunged toward a faint clearing at the grove's edge. Figures flickered in and out of existence, sometimes just inches away. Stones cracked and shifted, forming small barriers to slow me. Every step was anticipated, but I forced my legs forward, fighting panic and disorientation. I could hear echoes of the violence replayed endlessly in whispers, shadows, and faint movements. The grove's warning was clear: stay or disappear. Finally, I glimpsed the outer trail, pale light filtering through dense foliage. Figures lingered at the edge, motionless yet aware, as though holding the threshold. Roots twisted across my path one last time, and carvings glimmered faintly. I forced my legs to carry me forward, heart hammering, lungs burning. Behind me, the grove hummed with the past, but the edge was near. Escape felt possible, though the spirits watched, patient and eternal, waiting for any hesitation. I pushed toward the faint opening I had glimpsed beyond the grove. Roots dragged at my boots, and the figures flickered closer with every step. Their pale faces turned slowly in my direction, hollow eyes fixed on me. The carvings along the stones pulsed faintly, as if reacting to my movement. Every whisper carried warning and accusation. My chest tightened, but stopping meant surrendering to the grove's rhythm. I forced my legs forward. A cold breeze carried a sharp metallic scent through the clearing. One of the figures sharpened into terrible clarity, its mouth opening as if to shout, though no sound came. Shadows twisted across the trunks, echoing my movements. The carvings glimmered faintly like embers beneath ash. The grove felt aware of every thought I had. I clenched my teeth and continued forward, ignoring the instinct to freeze beneath the watching spirits. Branches whipped across my jacket as I pushed through the trees. A loose stone rolled beneath my boot, nearly sending me down. Faces formed along the roots and trunks, twisted in silent screams. The grove was weaponizing memory, projecting its past into every shadow. Objects shifted slightly, never enough to strike, only to threaten. My lungs burned as I moved, understanding that hesitation would leave me trapped inside their endless performance. Roots snaked across the trail, catching at my boots. The ghostly figures mirrored my movements, their motions growing sharper, more violent. I jumped over a fallen branch and stumbled forward again. The carvings glowed faintly along the ground, each name carved deep into wood and stone. It felt as though every step awakened another memory inside the grove. My legs trembled, but the pale glow of the outer trail remained ahead. The figures stretched unnaturally between the trees, their forms bending toward me as though pulled by invisible strings. One raised an arm slowly, pointing somewhere behind me. I refused to look. Stones shifted underfoot and branches creaked above, guiding my path without touching me. The grove seemed determined to keep me inside its circle of memory. I focused only on the thinning trees ahead and kept moving. I stumbled into a shallow depression hidden beneath the ash. My knee slammed into the ground, sending a burst of pain through my leg. Faces appeared in the roots beside me, mouths open in frozen terror. I scrambled up quickly, heart pounding. The shadows across the trunks twisted in unnatural angles, echoing the ghostly figures. Every instinct screamed that the grove wanted me to fall and remain there forever. Branches lashed outward as I forced my way forward. One struck my shoulder, spinning me sideways. At the base of a nearby tree, another face formed from bark into shadow. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow me as I passed. The carvings along the stones pulsed again, faint light rippling across their surfaces. My chest heaved as I pushed onward, the faint clearing ahead glowing like a fragile promise. The air vibrated with whispers, too quiet to fully understand. Each step seemed to echo through the grove, answered by the slow movements of the spirits behind me. Stones shifted slightly, nudging my path forward. Faces appeared and vanished along the trunks, as if the forest itself breathed them into existence. My muscles trembled with exhaustion, but the thinning trees ahead told me the boundary was close. A branch snapped loudly above me and I ducked instinctively. A figure flickered directly beside the trail, its outline trembling like heat above a fire. The carvings along the wood glowed brighter for a moment, then dimmed again. I forced myself not to stop. Every instinct told me to run, but panic would only send me stumbling, step by step. I moved toward the growing light beyond the grove. The ghostly figures moved faster now, their silent reenactment accelerating behind me. I could feel their attention like cold hands against my back. Roots twisted beneath the ash, trying to catch my feet. My breath came in ragged bursts as I pushed through the last cluster of trunks. The clearing ahead widened, pale moonlight spilling across the ground just beyond the grove's shadow. The canopy above began to thin, letting faint silver light reach the forest floor. The carvings along the stones grew dimmer as I approached the boundary. Behind me, the figures slowed, their movements losing definition. Roots shifted one last time beneath my boots, then settled into stillness. My legs shook violently, but the open trail was only a few steps away now. I crossed into the clearing and nearly collapsed. The grove ended abruptly behind me, its dark trees forming a solid wall of shadow. The figures remained within it, faint and distant again. Their silent movements continued, repeating the same violent sequence as before, but they did not follow. The boundary held them there, like an invisible barrier. I staggered farther along the trail, forcing myself to keep moving. The oppressive weight of the grove lifted slightly with each step. When I glanced back, the carvings were no longer glowing, and the figures were barely visible between the trunks. The whispers faded into ordinary forest silence. My lungs burned, but the path ahead remained clear. Branches no longer snapped or shifted as I passed. The forest felt normal again, quiet and still beneath the towering trees. My heartbeat slowly steadied as the distance between me and the grove increased. Whatever haunted that clearing remained behind its boundary. The trail stretched ahead through the darkness, and for the first time since entering the grove, nothing tried to stop me. Story 10. The Red Mist Passage. I noticed the mist before I noticed the trail. It drifted between the redwoods in thin streaks of dull crimson, faint enough to mistake for sunset light caught in fog. The path itself was narrow, barely wider than a deer track. Something about it felt deliberate, like a corridor pressed into the forest floor. Curiosity pushed me forward. The deeper I walked, the thicker the mist became. The air smelled metallic like wet iron. At first I thought it came from the soil, but the scent seemed suspended in the mist itself. It curled around the trunks and drifted across the trail in slow waves. My footsteps sounded strangely muted, as if the forest floor were swallowing the noise. I glanced behind me once. The trail I had just walked already looked longer than it should have. Redwoods towered on both sides, their trunks rising so high the canopy vanished into shadow. The mist threaded between them like smoke drifting through pillars. Every few steps, I had the strange feeling that the path had shifted slightly. The turns weren't the same ones I remembered passing moments earlier. Still, the trail remained clear ahead, inviting and oddly straight, like it had been carved intentionally. I stopped to check my bearings. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the park, but the compass on it spun slowly before settling in the wrong direction. I frowned and turned in place. The trees behind me looked different somehow. The mist had thickened, and the trail I'd followed into the passage seemed longer and narrower than before. When I continued walking, the forest grew quieter. Even the distant rustling of wind through branches had faded. Only the faint movement of the red mist remained, sliding across the trail in soft waves. It brushed against my jacket as I passed through it, leaving damp streaks along the fabric. The deeper I went, the more the path felt like a tunnel cut through the forest. The trail should have curved back toward the main route by now. I knew the park well enough to recognize that. Instead, the corridor of trees continued in a straight line, the trunks perfectly spaced, as if arranged. My footsteps slowed. Something felt wrong with the distance I traveled. The forest looked identical in every direction, repeating the same towering shapes through the mist. A sudden pressure brushed against my back. It wasn't wind. It felt more like someone nudging me forward with an invisible hand. I spun around, expecting to see another hiker. The trail behind me was empty. The red mist drifted quietly between the trees, swirling for a moment before settling again. I told myself it was just a strange pocket of air moving through the forest. I kept walking, though the feeling didn't leave. Every few steps, that same gentle pressure pushed at my back, urging me forward along the narrow path. When I slowed down, the pressure faded. When I stopped completely, it returned firmer this time, like a warning. My chest tightened. The trail ahead disappeared deeper into the red fog. The mist thickened until the trees on either side blurred into tall shadows. I could still see the path beneath my boots, but the world beyond it had faded into dull crimson haze. Somewhere ahead, something shifted. The movement was enormous, slow and heavy, like a shadow sliding behind a wall. I froze, listening, but the forest remained silent. Another push touched my back, stronger this time. I stumbled forward a step before catching myself. The pressure vanished immediately afterward, as if satisfied. My pulse quickened. Whatever it was, it didn't want me standing still. The path ahead stretched deeper into the mist, and I had the growing sensation that I was being guided somewhere very specific. The trail dipped slightly downhill. The red mist pooled thicker here, swirling around my legs as I walked. Through the haze, I thought I saw something towering between the trees ahead. Not a trunk, something broader. It shifted slowly, its outline barely visible through the fog. I blinked, and the shape disappeared, leaving only the quiet corridor of redwoods again. I slowed again, trying to listen. For a moment, the forest felt completely still. Then the pressure returned, stronger than before, pushing squarely between my shoulder blades. I staggered forward several steps before regaining balance. My heart pounded in my ears. Whatever surrounded this trail clearly didn't want me stopping long enough to look around. The mist parted briefly as I rounded a bend. For a second, the forest opened just enough for me to glimpse something massive beyond the trees. A dark surface stretched upward into the fog, curved like the side of a mountain. Then the mist closed again, hiding it completely. I stood frozen, trying to understand what I'd seen. The pressure returned immediately, forcing me to move again. It felt impatient now, less like guidance, and more like insistence. The trail continued deeper into the red fog, twisting between the towering trunks. Somewhere beyond the mist, that same enormous presence shifted again, too large to belong to anything that should exist inside a forest. The path narrowed even further ahead, squeezing between two ancient redwoods whose trunks nearly touched. Beyond them, the mist glowed darker, thicker, almost solid. I hesitated at the threshold. The pressure at my back intensified sharply, urging me through the gap. As I stepped between the trees, I realized the forest on the other side looked impossibly larger than the one I'd just left. The moment I cleared the narrow gap, the forest changed. Trees spread farther apart, their trunks rising into a ceiling of red fog that seemed miles above me. When I glanced back, the two redwoods I had passed between were already fading into the mist, their shapes dissolving slowly. The trail stretched forward in a perfectly straight corridor that hadn't existed before. Then the pressure returned at my back, firm and deliberate, pushing me forward again. I walked faster now, uneasy with the strange scale of the forest around me. The ground beneath my boots sounded hollow, echoing faintly with every step, as if there were empty space beneath the soil. The mist flowed slowly across the path, never fully clearing. Somewhere far above the treetops, something shifted. The movement was slow and enormous, like a continent drifting through clouds. I kept my eyes locked on the trail. The pressure pulsed again, harder this time. When I slowed even slightly, it pushed me forward immediately. The trail curved around a cluster of redwoods, but the forest beyond looked exactly the same as before. Repeating trunks, endless distance, the same narrow corridor stretching ahead. The red mist rippled across the path in slow waves. Somewhere behind the fog, a deep vibration rolled through the ground beneath my boots. The mist parted briefly to my right. For a moment I saw something towering far beyond the trees. A massive surface curved upward into the fog, its texture ridged and uneven like weathered stone. It moved slowly, revealing scale that made the redwoods look small and fragile. Then the mist slid back across the forest, swallowing the view and hiding the impossible shape before I could fully understand what I'd seen. My breathing quickened as I kept moving forward. The pressure at my back never stopped. It kept me walking at a steady pace down the narrow corridor of trees, guiding me whether I wanted it to or not. Every time I tried to slow down, the force returned stronger. The trail sloped gently downhill, and the mist pooled thicker around my legs. The forest no longer felt like a trail. It felt like a channel guiding me somewhere. Another deep shift rolled through the forest. The ground trembled faintly beneath my feet, subtle but unmistakable. Ahead of me, the red fog thinned for a moment, revealing something vast above the tree line. A dark shape stretched across the sky, folding slowly like a living landscape drifting through clouds. I froze in place before realizing what I'd done. The pressure slammed into my back instantly, forcing me forward again. I stumbled several steps before regaining my balance. The mist churned violently now, swirling between the trees, as if reacting to the movement above the forest. I refused to look upward again. Whatever surrounded this place was too large to understand, and the brief glimpse had already been enough. The only thing that mattered now was the trail beneath my boots and the direction it kept forcing me to follow. The corridor of trees began climbing uphill. My legs burned as I pushed forward through the thickening mist, breathing harder with every step. Behind me, the massive presence shifted again, releasing a low rumble that vibrated through the trunks around me. The sound didn't belong to the forest. It felt distant and enormous, like something moving slowly through a space far larger than the world I understood. The mist thinned suddenly as I reached the crest of the hill. For a second, the forest opened wider than before, giving me a clearer view beyond the trees. Through the clearing fog, I saw the thing clearly. A colossal form stretched across the sky, its surface folding slowly across itself like shifting terrain. It was so vast that the entire forest seemed to exist beneath it like a small patch of ground. The sight rooted me to the spot. The entity wasn't standing inside the forest at all. The forest existed beneath it, contained inside whatever immense space the thing occupied. The redwoods looked tiny against its impossible scale. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Then the pressure returned instantly. Violent this time, shoving me forward as if the path itself refused to let me stand there and witness it. I ran now without thinking. The trail sloped downward, toward a faint break in the trees ahead. The red mist churned wildly behind me, rolling through the forest like a storm cloud chasing the corridor. Another massive shift echoed through the ground beneath my boots. The vibration traveled up my legs as I ran. I didn't dare look back again. The opening ahead grew wider with every step. Beyond it, normal moonlight filtered through ordinary redwoods that looked almost comforting compared to the endless corridor behind me. The mist began thinning rapidly around the trail. The pressure at my back surged again, nearly throwing me forward as if something wanted me out of that place as quickly as possible. I burst through the final line of trees and stumbled onto a wider trail. My boots hit solid ground as the red mist stopped abruptly at the edge of the corridor behind me. It hung between the trunks like a wall of dull crimson fog, refusing to cross the invisible boundary where the narrow path ended. For a moment, the mist shifted again. Far beyond the trees, something enormous moved slowly within it. The massive surface folded across the sky like a drifting continent, stretching farther than the forest itself. Then the fog closed again, hiding the impossible shape behind layers of red haze. I stepped backward along the open trail, breathing hard as the pressure finally disappeared. Forest around me sounded normal again, wind moving through redwood branches, distant leaves rustling softly in the dark. Behind me, the narrow corridor of red mist remained perfectly still between the trunks. Whatever existed inside that passage had not followed me out. I turned and kept walking until the faint red glow disappeared completely behind the trees. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as unsettling as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more strange explorations. See you next time.